For nearly 700 years, Japan was ruled by the sword. Warriors decided the fate of emperors. Castles rose, clans fell, and blood shaped the land. Then, the blades went silent. The samurai did not disappear in a single battle. They were erased by gunpowder, betrayal, and time itself. This is not just the story of warriors. It is the story of how an entire world was built, and how it was quietly destroyed. Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we step quietly into the long shadow of the samurai, a world shaped not only by steel and blood, but by silence, restraint, poetry, and unspoken vows. A world where loyalty could outweigh life itself, and where rebellion often wore the mask of duty. From the distant beginnings of Japan's warrior class to the gradual fading of the shogunate's power, we will follow the slow turning of centuries, one era at a time, one conflict at a time. As always, I invite you to pause for a moment and ask yourself, where are you listening from tonight? What hour has the world reached where you are? Whether this story finds you at the end of a long day or carries you gently towards sleep beneath a quiet sky, this time is yours. Settle in. Let go. Listen. What follows is a story etched across nearly 1,000 years of history, and tonight it belongs to you. In the 9th century, the Japanese world revolved around the imperial court, radiant with ceremony and refinement. Kyoto, the capital, lay cradled between mountains like a jewel carefully set in stone. It was a city of silk and incense, of measured footsteps and carefully chosen words. Here, aristocrats of the Heian period lived lives governed by etiquette so intricate it bordered on ritual devotion. Days passed in the composition of poetry, the exchange of scented letters, and the quiet competition of elegance. Power was expressed not through force, but through lineage, marriage alliances, and beautifully worded decrees brushed onto paper. The emperor stood at the symbolic center of this universe, divine by ancestry, distant by design. His authority shimmered like a reflection on still water, real, revered, yet rarely tested. Beneath him, ministers maneuvered through webs of family ties and courtly intrigue, believing that the world could be governed by ink and precedent alone. Art flourished. Literature reached extraordinary heights. And yet, beyond the capital's gates, another reality was taking shape. Far from Kyoto's polished halls, the provinces were unraveling. Tax collectors were assaulted or killed. Estates were raided by bandits and rival clans. Famine and unrest followed poor harvests, and local strongmen began to rise where imperial authority had thinned to a rumor. The court, refined and inward-looking, possessed neither the will nor the means to enforce its commands across the countryside. It could not raise effective armies. It could not guarantee order. What it could do was delegate violence to those willing to wield it. And so, gradually and almost quietly, the sword began to speak louder than the scroll. From this mixture of neglect and necessity, the earliest samurai emerged. At first, they were not heroes or philosophers. They were practical men, mounted retainers hired by provincial landowners to protect estates, settle disputes, and assert claims against encroaching neighbors. Their loyalty was personal rather than ideological, rooted in blood ties, oaths sworn before witnesses, and the promise of land or protection. These warriors trained from childhood, mastering horseback archery, spear, and blade. They learned endurance, discipline, and the acceptance of death as a constant companion. Their lives bore little resemblance to those of Kyoto's aristocracy. They lived simply, close to the land, shaped by hardship and constant readiness. They fought skirmishes that would never be recorded by court historians. Their reputations were built not on verses or calligraphy, but on courage, decisiveness, and survival. They called themselves saburao, those who serve. Over time, the word would sharpen into something more defined. Samurai. By the 10th century, samurai identity had begun to solidify. Clans formed around shared ancestry and shared battles, their authority growing with every victory. Among them, two families rose steadily toward dominance, the Taira and the Minamoto. Both traced their lineage back to imperial blood, yet their power was forged far from the capital, hardened by frontier warfare and provincial rule. Though they continued to acknowledge the emperor in name, their true strength lay in the hundreds, eventually thousands, of warriors who followed them out of loyalty rather than obligation. These men did not yet seek to overthrow the court, but increasingly, they replaced it in the daily lives of the people they governed. Justice, protection, taxation, these functions now flowed through armed hands rather than imperial seals. The early samurai were not yet guided by the later ideals of Bushido. Their ethics were direct and often brutal, focused on vengeance, honor within the clan, and survival. Still, beneath this rough pragmatism stirred a deeper ambition, a desire for legitimacy, recognition, and a permanent place in history. The imperial court remained the sacred center of Japan, but for the first time, men born of dust and blood began to imagine themselves not merely as servants of that center, but as its rivals. This tension erupted dramatically in the eastern provinces, where imperial influence was weakest. In the year 939, a warrior of the Taira clan named Taira no Masakato crossed a line that few had dared to approach. What began as a dispute over land and inheritance spiraled into open rebellion. Masakato defeated rival clans, seized provincial offices, and did something that shook the foundations of the realm. He declared himself emperor. This was not the act of a foreign invader or a madman. Masakato was of noble blood, trained in martial tradition, and supported by followers who saw in him the only authority that still functioned. In the chaos of the eastern provinces, his rule offered order where the court had long been absent. For a brief, astonishing moment, Japan had two emperors, one in Kyoto, robed in ritual and tradition, and one in the east, armored in steel and crowned by force. The court reacted with fear and desperation. Prayers were offered at shrines. Omens were sought. When the gods remained silent, the government issued bounties and rallied loyal warriors. In 940, Masakato was defeated. His severed head was displayed in Kyoto as proof that imperial authority still endured. But the damage was done. Masakato's rebellion revealed a truth that could not be forgotten. The emperor's reach no longer spanned the entire realm. Power could be seized by strength alone. Others learned from his failure. The rise of the samurai did not slow, it accelerated. In the generations that followed, the Taira and Minamoto clans expanded relentlessly. They commanded fleets and cavalry, controlled vast territories, and maintained private armies that dwarfed anything the court could muster. Their leaders continued to bow in ceremony, exchange gifts, and speak politely before the emperor's ministers. Yet behind these gestures lay a clear understanding. The age of poetry and paper rule was fading. Kyoto still glimmered. Lanterns still lit garden paths. Courtiers still debated the placement of screens and the subtleties of verse. But beyond the capital, the old order was dissolving. Samurai lords ruled in all but name, enforcing justice with their own hands and collecting taxes by the blade. The Heian world was entering its twilight, and in the provinces, the future was already sharpening its sword. When Taira no Kayamori passed from the world in the spring of 1181, the silence he left behind was heavier than any army. For decades, his presence alone had bent the court and provinces to his will. Now, with his death, the fragile order he had enforced through fear, wealth, and relentless force began to unravel almost immediately. The capital of Kyoto, long accustomed to living beneath the shadow of his authority, felt suddenly exposed. Courtiers whispered behind screens, priests searched the heavens for omens, and astrologers warned that the balance of the realm had been disturbed. Kayamori's heirs inherited his titles, his estates, and his armies, but not his singular dominance. They were many but divided, proud but uncertain. Where Kayamori had ruled through terror and decisiveness, his descendants hesitated, bound by court etiquette and internal rivalries. The Terra banners still flew, but the hand that once guided them with ruthless clarity was gone. Across the provinces, men who had remained silent for years now tested the limits of defiance. Old grudges resurfaced. Long-suppressed ambitions found new breath. Most dangerous of all was the quiet resurgence of the Minamoto clan. Thought destroyed after the purges of the Heiji Rebellion, the Minamoto had endured in fragments, scattered sons, distant cousins, loyal retainers who had survived by bending rather than breaking. Among them was Minamoto no Yoritomo, the eldest surviving son of Minamoto no Yashitomo, the very boy whose life Kayamori had spared years earlier. Exiled to the eastern provinces, Yoritomo had grown to manhood under watchful eyes, his existence tolerated but never trusted. He learned patience there, he learned restraint, and he learned how power truly worked beyond the walls of the capital. In the year 1180, the fragile peace finally shattered. Prince Machihito, a royal with Minamoto blood, issued a bold and desperate call to arms. He declared the Terra illegitimate, accused them of corrupting the throne, and summoned the Minamoto and their allies to rise in the name of restoring imperial order. Though the prince himself would be swiftly hunted down and killed by Terra forces, his proclamation traveled faster than any army. It ignited a spark long waiting for fuel. Yoritomo answered. Raising his banner in the eastern hills near Shibashiyama, he declared open rebellion against the Terra. His first engagement was a disaster. Outnumbered and betrayed by local allies, his forces were scattered by a Terra army in a driving storm. Yet unlike so many before him, Yoritomo did not vanish into defeat. He survived. He escaped by sea, and in survival his legend began. Retreating to the Kanto region, far from the reach of Kyoto, Yoritomo rebuilt. He understood something Kayamori never fully grasped. That lasting power did not come from dominating the court, but from commanding the provinces. He forged alliances with Eastern warrior families who resented Terra control. He rewarded loyalty with land. He governed not as a distant noble, but as a warlord who listened, negotiated, and remembered favors. While the Terra struggled to maintain control from the capital, their authority fraying with each passing month, the Minamoto cause grew stronger. Other leaders emerged alongside Yoritomo. His younger brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, brilliant, daring, and fearless, carved a path through enemy forces with tactics that bordered on the impossible. Where Yoritomo was cautious and calculating, Yoshitsune was swift and merciless, striking like lightning against larger armies and retreating before retaliation could form. The Genpei War, as it would later be known, consumed Japan for 5 brutal years. Battles raged across mountains, rivers, and coastal plains. Castles burned. Temples were fortified. Entire clans were extinguished. The old courtly ideals of restraint and balance collapsed beneath the weight of total war. For the first time, the fate of the nation rested not on imperial lineage or aristocratic ceremony, but on the outcome of military campaigns led almost entirely by samurai. The final blow came in 1185 at the Battle of Dan no Yura. On the waters of the inland sea, Minamoto and Terra fleets clashed in a massive naval engagement. Tide and current shifted throughout the day, and with them, the advantage of battle. At its heart was the child emperor Entoku, grandson of Kayamori, carried aboard a Terra vessel along with the sacred imperial regalia. When defeat became inevitable, tragedy unfolded. The emperor's grandmother leapt into the sea with the boy in her arms, choosing death over capture. With them sank one of the imperial treasures, lost forever beneath the waves. The Terra were annihilated. With their fall, an era ended, but something far greater was being born. Minamoto no Yoritomo did not return power to the emperor. Instead, he did what no warrior before him had dared to do openly. In 1192, he accepted the title of Sei Taishogun. barbarian subduing great generalissimo, establishing a new military government in Kamakura. The emperor remained, sacred and symbolic, but real authority now belonged to the shogun. Japan had entered the age of the samurai. What began as hired swords defending distant estates had evolved into a ruling class that reshaped the nation. The court would endure, poetry would still be written, and rituals would continue. But power had permanently shifted from silk sleeves to armored hands. The world Kayamori had tried to dominate through force alone was transformed by those who learned to rule through structure, loyalty, and control of the land. The storm had come, and when it passed, Japan was no longer the same. The Genpei War was never a single clash of armies, never a clean contest decided by one glorious victory. It was a long, exhausting struggle that unfolded unevenly across mountains, rivers, and coastlines. Allegiances shifted like sand. Ambush followed ambush. Fleets burned at sea. Villages were erased overnight, and entire bloodlines vanished in silence. Provinces that had once sworn loyalty to the Terra began to drift toward the Minamoto, some drawn by promises of reward, others repelled by the excess and arrogance that now clung to Terra rule. Samurai lords who had once bowed before Kayamori's heirs began to calculate the future with colder, more pragmatic eyes. In the east, Minamoto no Yoritomo advanced patiently. Rather than chasing glory on the battlefield, he built power methodically. He established his headquarters in Kamakura, a fortified settlement nestled between forested hills and the sea, far from the intrigues and decadence of Kyoto. From there, he forged alliances, dispatched messengers across the Kanto region, and bound warrior families to his cause through land grants and oaths of loyalty. Yoritomo did not fight as his ancestors had, sword in hand at the front lines. He ruled from a distance, orchestrating the war while others carried it out in his name. Foremost among them was his younger half-brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune. Where Yoritomo was cautious and deliberate, Yoshitsune was swift, daring, and brilliant. He moved like a shadow through the mountains, leading forced marches by night, striking where the enemy least expected, and vanishing before retaliation could gather. The Terra, accustomed to power rooted in court influence and maritime trade, were ill-prepared for this kind of war. Their strength lay in bureaucracy, wealth, and ritual authority. But the battlefields of Japan favored mobility, local knowledge, and ruthless adaptability. One by one, their advantages eroded. Defeats at places like Kurakara and Ichinatani shattered the illusion of Terra invincibility. At Ichinatani, Yoshitsune led a legendary assault down a nearly vertical cliffside, crashing into the enemy camp from an impossible direction. Panic spread through the Terra ranks. What began as a retreat became a rout. With each loss, the Terra forfeited more than territory. They lost prestige, and with that loss came something far more dangerous, the disappearance of fear. Yoshitsune's fame spread rapidly. His name became a rallying cry for warriors disillusioned with Terra decay. Songs were sung of his victories. Stories grew with every retelling. Yet admiration carries its own danger. From Kamakura, Yoritomo watched his brothers rise with unease. He recognized Yoshitsune's genius, but he also recognized a potential rival. Glory in war had toppled many regimes before. Yoritomo intended to ensure it would not topple his. The final confrontation came at sea. In the spring of 1185, the Terra gathered what remained of their forces at Dan no Yura, a narrow strait in the inland sea. There, surrounded by their fleet and clinging to the last symbol of their legitimacy, the young emperor and Toku, grandson of Kayamori, they prepared for a final stand. Yoshitsune led the Minamoto fleet into battle. Arrows darkened the sky. Ships collided and locked together. The tide itself became a weapon, shifting throughout the day and altering the balance of power. For hours, the outcome remained uncertain. Then betrayal decided what swords could not. A Terra commander defected in the midst of battle, revealing fleet formations and exposing weaknesses. The Minamoto pressed their advantage. As defeat became inevitable, the Taira made a final, tragic choice. The 6-year-old emperor was taken into the arms of his grandmother. She whispered prayers, clutched the sacred regalia, and leapt into the sea. Many followed her. The waves closed over armor, banners, and imperial blood alike. With them sank the Taira clan. Their destruction marked more than the end of a ruling family. It marked the collapse of an entire world. The court in Kyoto endured, its ceremonies unbroken and its titles intact, but its authority was hollowed out. Power had passed irrevocably into the hands of warriors. Yoritomo returned victorious, not as a rebel, but as a ruler. In 1192, the emperor formally granted him the title of Sei Taishogun, a designation once reserved for generals campaigning against distant frontiers. In Yoritomo's hands, it became something entirely new. He was no mere commander. He was the architect of a system that rooted authority not in bloodline or divine ancestry, but in land, loyalty, and force. The Genpei War had ended, but its scars lingered across the provinces, burned estates, emptied villages, shattered families. Yet from that devastation emerged a new order, harsh and hierarchical, forged in blood and discipline. The age of the samurai had begun in earnest. From the ashes of the Taira, Yoritomo forged Japan's first shogunate. The emperor remained in name, but the sword now ruled the land. While poets in Kyoto resumed their verses and temples rang bells for the dead, Yoritomo worked quietly in Kamakura, laying the foundations of permanence. He understood that victory alone could not hold a nation together. Structure was required. Law, loyalty enforced not by ritual, but by consequence. Kamakura was no ancient capital. It lacked sacred lineage and imperial grandeur. That was precisely its strength. Carved from forested hills and guarded by natural defenses, it stood apart from aristocratic decay. There, Yoritomo gathered his generals, advisors, and vassals, men shaped by war rather than ceremony. Together, they built a government that bypassed the old nobility entirely. He appointed military governors, shugo, to oversee provinces, and estate stewards to manage land and collect taxes in his name. These positions went not to courtiers, but to veteran warriors bound by loyalty and reward. A parallel system emerged, answering to Kamakura rather than Kyoto. On parchment, the emperor still reigned supreme. In reality, decisions were now made by armored men in the east. This was Yoritomo's true revolution, not the overthrow of the throne, but the creation of a government that rendered it irrelevant. He called it the Bakufu, the tent government, a name drawn from the mobile command posts of war. But this tent was no temporary shelter. It was built to endure. Laws were codified. Authority was centralized. Disputes among warriors were judged in Kamakura. The emperor's officials could no longer act without shogunal approval. Japan now had two centers of power, and only one commanded the sword. The world born from the Genpei War would shape the next 7 centuries. And it began not with a crown, but with a warrior who understood that true rule was not seized in a single moment of triumph, but built, patiently, upon the ruins of the old world. For a society long governed by aristocratic whim and inherited privilege, this transformation was nothing short of an earthquake. For the old courtly elite, it was humiliation. For the samurai, it felt like liberation. At last, the men who fought, bled, and enforced order would no longer kneel before poets and courtiers. Yet Yoritomo's victory cast long shadows. War had hardened him, but it had also carved fear into his soul. Survival had taught him that threats often wore familiar faces. No one embodied that danger more clearly than his own brother. Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the brilliant commander whose daring victories had broken the Taira, had become a living legend. He was admired by warriors, celebrated by storytellers, and loved by the people. His youth, grace, and tragic charisma made him unforgettable and intolerable in the eyes of the shogun. Yoritomo saw in his brother not a hero, but a rival. Fame was power, and power invited rebellion. Accused of treason, Yoshitsune was hunted relentlessly. Once loyal allies turned away. Safe havens closed their gates. He fled from province to province, pursued not by enemies, but by the state his victories had helped create. In the far north, surrounded and betrayed, Yoshitsune chose death over capture. He took his own life, ending the legend in silence and blood. Yoritomo did not mourn. He did not look back. Power, once seized, demanded sacrifice, and he offered it without hesitation. When Yoritomo died in 1199, he left behind something Japan had not known in over a century: a stable government. The shogunate he forged would rise and fall through violence, reform, and betrayal, but its central truth would endure. Warriors, not courtiers, would rule the land. The emperor still sat upon the throne, wrapped in ritual and divine ancestry, but his voice had faded beneath the clangor of armor. The court still composed poetry and danced beneath lantern light. Yet the men who governed Japan now wore swords at their waist and swore loyalty not to heaven, but to law and command. Thus began the age of feudal Japan, not through conquest alone, but through reordering. Yoritomo's revolution was quiet, deliberate, and merciless. He sought no glory. He sought control, and behind the stone walls of Kamakura, surrounded by loyal men and rigid systems, he found it. Yoritomo's death came without drama. In the early months of 1199, he fell from his horse during a winter ride. No battlefield, no assassin's blade, no final command. The first shogun vanished as abruptly as he had risen. Yet the structure he built did not collapse. Its gears were already turning in other hands. Those hands belonged to the Hojo clan. For years, they had stood beside Yoritomo, watching, learning, waiting. Now they moved with quiet precision, not through open war or grand proclamations, but through manipulation, marriage, and law. Hojo Tokumasa, Yoritomo's father-in-law, acted first. A seasoned and calculating man, he understood that real power lay not in holding titles, but in controlling those who bore them. Yoritomo's eldest son, Yori, inherited the title of shogun. Young and impulsive, he lacked his father's restraint. Tokumasa surrounded him with Hojo loyalists, severed him from independent allies, and fed him suspicion. When Yori attempted to assert his authority, plotting against his handlers, Tokumasa struck decisively. In 1203, the young shogun was forced to abdicate, placed under house arrest, and ultimately murdered. His younger brother, Sanetomo, still a child, was installed in his place. The Hojo now ruled openly, but still from behind the curtain. Yet the true architect of their dominance was not Tokumasa, but his daughter, Hojo Masako. Widow of Yoritomo and remembered as the nun shogun, Masako took Buddhist vows after her husband's death, cloaking herself in humility and devotion. But beneath the robes lived a mind as sharp as any general's. She navigated the corridors of power with calm resolve, guiding the shogunate from within. When Tokumasa overreached and sought to monopolize authority entirely, Masako turned against her own father. Aligning with her brother, Hojo Yashitoki, she forced Tokumasa into retirement and exile. No blood stained the palace walls, but the lesson was clear. The Hojo had mastered Yoritomo's methods. The Minamoto line soon faded, replaced by figurehead shoguns drawn from noble or imperial branches. Titles remained. Authority did not. The true rulers were the Hojo regents, the shikin, who governed through law, counsel, and quiet force. In 1221, the imperial court made its final gamble. Emperor Go-Toba, bitter and resentful, raised the banner of rebellion in Kyoto. He called upon aristocrats, monks, and provincial governors to restore imperial authority. His proclamations spoke of divine right and sacred order. But the age he invoked no longer existed. The response from Kamakura was swift and merciless. Hojo Yashitoki led shogunal forces west. Kyoto fell within days. Go-Toba was captured and exiled to a remote island, where he would spend his remaining years composing poetry and mourning a lost world. The court's military power was shattered forever. To ensure it would never rise again, the Hojo established a permanent military office in Kyoto, the Rokuhara Tandai, to watch the emperor and suppress any future ambition. The samurai had not only one power, they had institutionalized it. Law was codified, councils were formed, samurai conduct, inheritance, and land rights were regulated to preserve order. Stability replaced honor, structure replaced impulse. The emperor still performed rituals. The court still existed, but meaning had drained from it. The true court now lay in Kamakura. For over a century, the Hojo would rule Japan, guiding it through an uneasy peace. They subdued the provinces and bound the emperor, yet no regime born of war endures unchallenged. Beyond the seas, beyond trade routes and familiar enemies, a new force was stirring, one unlike any Japan had ever faced. As the 13th century dawned, the realm seemed calm. Fields yielded rice. Roads were patrolled. Law was enforced. But far across the waters of East Asia, hooves thundered across continents and banners rose beneath foreign skies. A storm was coming, and this time it would not be born from within Japan, but from an empire that had already conquered the world beyond the horizon. The Mongol Empire, born from the endless grasslands of the steppe and forged in blood by the will of Genghis Khan, was moving toward Japan. It was an empire unlike any the islands had ever known, vast, merciless, and accustomed to conquest. Seas separated Japan from the continent, and for generations those waters had served as a natural shield. But distance alone could not stop an empire that believed the world itself was meant to kneel. The first warning did not arrive with sails or soldiers, but with words. In the year 1268, envoys of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the newly established Yuan dynasty, arrived bearing letters addressed to Japan. Their tone was cold, formal, and absolute. Kublai wrote as a sovereign who had never known defeat. He did not negotiate. He instructed. He warned that submission would bring peace, and resistance would bring destruction. Most telling of all, he did not address the emperor in Kyoto. Instead, the letters were sent directly to Kamakura, to the military authorities who truly ruled the land. It was a deliberate insult, a recognition of reality that stripped the imperial court of even symbolic relevance. The message was clear. The Mongols understood where power truly lay. The Hojo regents read the letters and chose silence. To reply would be to acknowledge Mongol supremacy. To refuse openly would invite war before Japan was ready. Silence, they hoped, might buy time. But silence was an answer the Mongols would not accept. In 1274, the first invasion came. From the ports of Korea, already subdued by Mongol force, an armada of nearly 900 ships set sail. Aboard them were more than 20,000 warriors, a terrifying coalition of Mongol horsemen, Chinese infantry, and Korean auxiliaries. They carried iron bows, siege engines, and weapons unknown to Japan. Among them were black powder bombs, devices that screamed through the air and exploded in bursts of flame, smoke, and shrapnel. The invasion swept through the outlying islands first. Tsushima fell in a storm of blood. Its defenders were slaughtered. Iki Island followed, its resistance crushed with equal brutality. Then the fleet moved toward Kyushu, anchoring in Hakata Bay, the gateway to Japan itself. What followed was chaos. The samurai fought with courage and skill, but they were unprepared for the kind of war the Mongols waged. Japanese warfare had long been shaped by ritual and personal honor. Warriors announced their names, challenged foes individually, and fought for reputation as much as victory. The Mongols cared for none of it. They advanced in disciplined formations, loosed coordinated volleys of arrows that turned the sky black, and pressed forward without pause. Drums thundered across the battlefield, controlling movement and sowing terror. Their tactics, honed across Asia, overwhelmed the defenders. Panic spread through Hakata as Mongol forces established a foothold on Japanese soil. And then the wind rose. Without warning, a typhoon tore through the bay. The storm was savage and unrelenting, as if summoned by the ancient gods of the islands themselves. Ships anchored offshore were smashed against one another or driven onto the rocks. Masts snapped. Hulls split. Men were swallowed by the sea. By morning, the invasion lay in ruins. Those who survived fled in terror, their conquest undone not by blade or arrow, but by wind and water. Japan had been spared. The shogunate proclaimed it divine intervention. A name was given to the storm, Kamikaze, the divine wind. It became legend, whispered with awe and gratitude. But in Kamakura, the regents were not deceived. They knew the Mongols would return. In the years that followed, Japan prepared for war. Fortifications rose along the coast of Kyushu. Massive stone walls were constructed at Hakata Bay, stretching mile after mile to prevent future landings. Samurai from every province were summoned in rotation to garrison the defenses. Patrols were organized, weapons stockpiled. The nation waited. Yet this vigilance carried a hidden cost. The first invasion had been repelled by nature, not conquest. There was no enemy territory seized, no treasure taken, no land to distribute. The warriors who had answered the call received no reward. In the samurai world, loyalty was bound to compensation. Service without reward was a dangerous precedent. Resentment began to smolder. In 1281, the Mongols returned, this time in overwhelming force. Kublai Khan launched a second invasion, vast beyond precedent. 2 fleets were assembled, one from southern China, another from Korea. Together they numbered over 4,000 ships and nearly 140,000 men, one of the largest seaborne invasion forces in human history. The sea itself seemed to groan beneath their weight. When they arrived, the fighting was fiercer than before. The stone walls at Hakata held. Samurai launched daring night raids, boarding enemy ships, striking camps, and vanishing into the darkness. The defenders fought with desperation and resolve. Yet the enemy was endless, their numbers crushing. And once again the wind rose. A second typhoon struck the Mongol fleets as they clustered offshore. This storm was greater than the first. For days, waves battered the armada. Anchors snapped. Ships were hurled against rocks and reefs. Thousands drowned. Survivors washed ashore only to be killed or captured. The invasion was annihilated. The shores of Kyushu were littered with wreckage and corpses. The sea had become Japan's final defender. The legend of the divine wind was sealed forever. But victory had come at a ruinous price. The Bakufu's coffers were drained. Years of preparation had consumed the nation's wealth. And once again, there was no plunder to reward the warriors. The samurai returned home to empty hands, mounting debts and shrinking estates. They had saved the realm, yet gained nothing. The shogunate still stood, but its foundations had cracked. The Mongols would never return. But the damage they had done could not be undone by prayer or wind. The system itself was beginning to fail. The years that followed were not marked by open rebellion, but by silence. And within that silence, bitterness grew. The Hojo regents mistook obedience for loyalty. They believed the divine wind had proven their legitimacy. They believed the gods favored them. But the truth was harsher. The invasions had exposed a fatal contradiction at the heart of the Kamakura order. The shogunate ruled in the emperor's name, yet sidelined him entirely. Warriors fought and died for a system that could no longer sustain them. Aristocrats in Kyoto watched their authority fade into irrelevance. What had once been a compromise had become a fracture, and fractures, left unattended, become wounds. Japan had survived the greatest external threat it had ever faced. But the danger that now loomed did not come from across the sea. It rose from within, from warriors betrayed by victory, from institutions drained of legitimacy, and from a system stretched beyond its limits. The divine wind had saved the nation. It had not saved the regime. The man who finally tore that wound wide open was Emperor Go-Daigo. He was no battlefield commander. He had never stood armored beneath a rain of arrows, never charged with a blade drawn. Yet Go-Daigo was no ceremonial puppet, no passive figure drifting through rituals and prayers. Born in 1288, he ascended the throne in an age when emperors were expected to reign but never rule. Symbols wrapped in silk while real authority lay firmly in the hands of warriors and regents. Go-Daigo refused to accept that fate. He was learned, deeply read in classical texts, and profoundly influenced by the histories of China, where emperors had overthrown regents and reclaimed the mandate of heaven through will and resolve. To him, the throne was not merely sacred, it was sovereign. Power, he believed, was not something to be lent to warriors. It was something the emperor must wield himself. And so, quietly and cautiously, he began to plot. His first attempt came in 1331, and it failed. The Hojo Regency, though weakened by decades of strain, still possessed a formidable network of informants and loyal enforcers. The conspiracy was uncovered before it could mature. Kamakura moved swiftly. Go-Daigo was deposed, stripped of authority, and exiled to the remote Oki Islands, windswept and isolated, far from the political heart of Kyoto. There, surrounded by sea and silence, the emperor waited. In his absence, the Hojo installed a replacement emperor in Kyoto, a pliant figure draped in imperial robes, but devoid of real authority. Yet something had changed. Across the provinces, among the warrior class, dissatisfaction had begun to harden into doubt. Kamakura's rule felt rigid, unrewarding, and distant. The old loyalty forged by land grants and authority had eroded. From that unrest, new figures emerged. One was Kusunoki Masashige, a minor landholder from Kawachi province. He was no great lord, but he was a master of terrain, deception, and unconventional warfare. Fiercely loyal to Go-Daigo, Kusunoki raised a small but disciplined force and waged a campaign of resistance that defied expectations. At the mountain fortress of Chihaya, he withstood repeated assaults by vastly superior Hojo armies, using ingenuity, traps, and psychological warfare to repel them. His defiance became legend. Kusunoki did not fight for reward or conquest. He fought for an idea, the restoration of direct imperial rule. His banners flew in the name of righteousness, and his victories spread hope through the provinces like wildfire. Yet the decisive blow against the Hojo would come not from loyalists alone, but from within the very structure of the shogunate itself. That blow was delivered by Ashikaga Takauji. Takauji was of Minamoto blood, though generations removed, and had risen as a trusted general in service to Kamakura. He was skilled, ambitious, and perceptive. As the realm slid toward chaos, he saw what others could not. The Hojo were finished. Their authority endured only through habit, not loyalty. In 1333, Takauji was sent west to suppress imperial supporters. Instead, he betrayed his masters. He turned his army against the Hojo, marched into Kyoto, expelled the puppet emperor, and restored Go-Daigo to the throne. At the same time, another loyalist force led by Nidu Yashisada advanced on Kamakura itself. The city was surrounded, then overrun. Fires consumed its streets. Temples burned. The old seat of warrior power collapsed in blood and smoke. As defeat became inevitable, the remaining members of the Hojo clan gathered at their ancestral temple and took their own lives. It was not a battle. It was an ending. The Kamakura Shogunate, which had ruled Japan for nearly 150 years, was no more. For a brief, luminous moment, it seemed that Go-Daigo's dream had been realized. He returned to Kyoto in triumph, and proclaimed the restoration of direct imperial rule, the Kenmu Restoration. He declared the age of shoguns over and revived the language and rituals of ancient times, envisioning a realm governed once more by sacred authority. But the world he sought to resurrect no longer existed. The samurai had ruled provinces, commanded armies, judged disputes, and shaped the fate of the land. They had tasted power, and they would not surrender it to courtiers who spoke of virtue while ignoring sacrifice. The court, steeped in ceremony, failed to understand this new reality, and Ashikaga Takauji understood it all too well. Though he had restored the emperor, his reward was little more than polite acknowledgement. His warriors went unpaid. His influence was constrained. The court reasserted old hierarchies, dismissing the very class that had returned it to power. Disillusionment curdled into defiance. In 1336, Takauji raised his banners once more and marched on Kyoto, not as a liberator, but as a conqueror. Go-Daigo fled south, carrying the sacred imperial regalia with him, and establishing a rival court in the mountains of Yoshino. Takauji, in turn, installed another emperor in Kyoto, one willing to accept warrior dominance. Japan was split. For more than half a century, two imperial courts would claim legitimacy, north and south, each backed by competing armies and ideals. The land fractured into shifting alliances, betrayals, and endless conflict. The fall of Kamakura had not ended samurai rule. It had transformed it. The old vision, warriors serving beneath a sacred throne, had collapsed under its contradictions. In its place rose a harsher truth. The sword no longer served the throne. The sword was the throne. And the man who embodied that truth was Ashikaga Takauji, founder of a new shogunate, ruler through force and calculation, an architect of an age defined not by unity but by division. The fire that consumed Kamakura did not illuminate a single path forward. It left smoke, embers, and a fractured realm. Japan had survived invasion, overthrown its regents, and restored its emperor, only to discover that power, once seized by warriors, could never again be returned untouched. The age of fragile crowns had ended. What followed would be an era forged not in prayer, but in steel. It was an age of shifting loyalties and broken oaths. Provinces pledged allegiance to one emperor in the spring, only to swear fealty to another by autumn. Brothers found themselves standing beneath opposing banners. Warrior monks donned armor, temples bristled with palisades, and sacred halls became citadels of war. Two emperors, both of imperial blood, each claimed to speak with divine authority. Each declared himself the rightful voice of heaven. Yet it was not the gods who decided the fate of Japan. It was the samurai. Castles, watchtowers, and provinces flew the banners chosen not by ritual, but by force of arms. For nearly 60 years, the realm remained split. And within that division, Ashikaga Takauji and his descendants secured their power. In 1338, Takauji received the title of Seii Taishogun from the northern court. With that appointment, the Ashikaga Shogunate was born, not in the thunder of conquest, but through the quiet authority of ink, seals, and ritual. The very legitimacy Takauji had once defied now served to crown him. He established his government in Kyoto's Miramachi district, close enough to the imperial court to monitor it, yet distant enough to control it. Unlike Kamakura's remote stronghold, the Miramachi Bakufu ruled from within the capital itself. It was not a fortress of stone. It was a web of influence. But Takauji's shogunate was weaker at its core than that of Minamoto no Yoritamo. The Kamakura Bakufu had enforced order through rigid hierarchy. Its governors, Shugo and Jito, owed their authority directly to a centralized power. Takauji, by contrast, had risen through alliances. The provincial lords who had carried him to power demanded autonomy in return. He could not refuse them, nor did he try. The Ashikaga regime became less a pyramid than a loose confederation of powerful men. Each lord ruled his domain like a small kingdom. Loyalty was negotiated. Justice was flexible. In the absence of an unchallenged hand, old rivalries resurfaced, new ambitions ignited, and the seeds of future catastrophe were planted. Even within Takauji's own household, unity fractured. His younger brother, Ashikaga Tadayoshi, had long served as his closest advisor, the cautious counterweight to Takauji's relentless pragmatism. But over time, their visions diverged. Tadayoshi sought stability and lawful governance. Takauji saw survival through dominance. Their rivalry spilled into the open, poisoning the shogunate from within. In the 1350s, their feud erupted into open conflict, a civil war known as the Kano Disturbance. For years, the Bakufu was paralyzed. Alliances shifted. Armies marched against armies bearing the same family name. Tadayoshi was eventually poisoned. Takauji, worn down by decades of war and betrayal, died in 1358. He had founded a dynasty, but not a foundation. Yet the Ashikaga legacy endured. His son, Ashikaga Yashiakira, and his grandson, Ashikaga Yashimitsu, succeeded him as shoguns. Under their rule, the Ashikaga presided over a government that fused courtly elegance with battlefield brutality. They patronized Zen monasteries, commissioned gilded temples, and welcomed foreign embassies. Even as warlords fought over valleys and rice fields, the shoguns proclaimed unity. They wore silk and armor alike. They spoke of harmony and prepared for war. And always, in the background, the dual emperors lingered. Each claimed legitimacy. Each called for loyalty. Each embodied a nation that no longer knew how to be whole. Takauji had not abolished the throne. He had divided it. By turning legitimacy itself into a weapon, he inaugurated an era in which strength defined right. The sword replaced the brush, and Japan entered a new chapter, one marked by splendor and corruption, rebellion and fire. For a time, it seemed the Ashikaga shogunate might succeed where its predecessors had failed. Under Ashikaga Yashimitsu, the third shogun, the Muromachi Bakufu reached its height. In 1392, he brought an uneasy end to the war between the northern and southern courts, persuading the southern emperor to abdicate and reuniting the imperial line. Though real authority remained firmly in his hands, Yashimitsu ruled not only through force, but through spectacle, wealth, and diplomacy. He built the Golden Pavilion Kinkikuji, a structure as much a monument to worldly dominance as to Zen philosophy. He reopened relations with Ming China, transformed Japan into a node of international trade, and filled Kyoto with foreign luxuries and artistic brilliance. It was a golden age, at least on the surface, but gold in time flakes away. The strength of the Ashikaga shogunate proved to be an illusion, sustained by one man's charisma, wealth, and political skill. Beneath the veneer, the Bakufu's structure was already unraveling. Unlike Kamakura's centralized command, Muromachi governance relied on cooperation among powerful regional lords, the daimyo. These men were not bureaucrats. They were warlords. Their authority came from land, armies, and the loyalty of retainers. They had shed blood to place the Ashikaga in power, and they expected independence in return. Over time, they ceased to act as vassals and began to rule as kings. They levied their own taxes, enforced their own laws, and waged private wars under the polite fiction of obedience. The shogun could issue commands, but whether they were obeyed depended entirely on the ambitions of those who received them. This drift accelerated after Yashimitsu's death. His son lacked vision. His grandson, Ashikaga Yoshinori, ruled with such cruelty that he was assassinated in his own palace. Later shoguns were selected not for strength, but for convenience, children, puppets, or pliable figures manipulated by factions and regents. The Bakufu became a court of whispered conspiracies and empty decrees. With central authority hollowed out, the provinces ignited. Old feuds resurfaced. New rivalries formed. The daimyo, no longer restrained by shogunal prestige, turned on one another. And then came the spark that set the nation ablaze. In 1464, Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa, a man devoted more to aesthetics than governance, faced a succession crisis. Childless and indifferent, he named his brother Yoshimi as heir. But when his wife bore a son, she demanded that the child inherit instead. What should have been a private dispute became a national catastrophe. Powerful daimyo aligned behind rival claimants. Hosokawa Katsumoto, deputy shogun and seasoned commander, supported Yoshimi. Yamana Suzan, his bitter rival and father-in-law to the shogun, backed the infant heir. Their conflict was personal, political, and generational. In 1467, war erupted. What began as a succession dispute escalated into the Unin War, the most destructive conflict Japan had seen in centuries. Armies flooded Kyoto. Tens of thousands of soldiers turned the imperial capital into a battlefield. Temples became fortresses. Palaces were fortified, then burned. The court was reduced to a pawn in a game it no longer understood. The war dragged on for 10 years. When it ended in 1477, there was no victor, only ruin. Kyoto lay in ashes. Entire districts were destroyed. Aristocratic families fled, never to return. The city that had once embodied imperial authority became a scarred ruin, haunted by hunger and loss. The Ashikaga Shogunate, which had presided over the war and failed to stop it, emerged broken. Yoshimasa retired into artistic seclusion, leaving governance behind. The Bakufu's authority collapsed entirely. Across Japan, daimyo ceased to recognize central rule. When the smoke cleared, the country was no longer a single realm. It had fractured into a mosaic of competing domains, each ruled by its own warlord, each guided by its own ambition. Japan had entered the age of war. The idea of central rule faded into memory. The emperor still sat upon the throne, surrounded by thinning courtiers and hollow ceremonies. The shogun still carried the title, but it had become an empty shell, unsupported by armies or fear. Real power no longer flowed from Kyoto. It rested in the hands of those who could defend their land with steel and alliances. Men of humble origin rose to lordship. Ancient houses fell to their own retainers. Cities raised walls. Villages hired mercenaries. What had once been a feudal order collapsed into something far more volatile, an age of civil anarchy. The Unin War had produced no victor, but its legacy was unmistakable. It shattered the final illusion of national unity. It marked the end of aristocratic dominance and the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one not fought for courtly favor or inherited honor, but for survival itself. Japan entered the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. The Ashikaga still lingered in Kyoto, presiding over the ruins like spirits bound to a forgotten era. But the world had moved on. The provinces now belonged to the sword. And though it would take a century of blood to forge unity again, the forge had already been lit. When the smoke of the Unin War finally lifted from the scorched corridors of Kyoto, it revealed not a restored nation, but a fractured archipelago of ambition. Japan, once held together by a fragile thread of imperial ritual and shogunal authority, had come undone. The Ashikaga Bakufu remained seated in the charred capital, ruling in name alone. The emperor, too, remained in his palace, but his voice had grown so faint it scarcely carried beyond the garden walls. Into this vacuum stepped the daimyo, provincial lords who had once answered to both shogun and sovereign, and who now turned their blades toward one another. The land became a chessboard without a king. This was the Sengoku Jidai, a century of chaos in which power no longer belonged to titles, but to those who could seize it and hold it by force. The daimyo were many, their ambitions boundless. Untethered from the authority of the capital and unrestrained by ritual obligation, they ruled with impunity, carving Japan into territories governed like independent kingdoms. Some commanded vast provinces inherited through ancient bloodlines and reinforced by military might. Others rose through cunning and brutality, men of no noble heritage who took power with fire and steel. In this new Japan, birth mattered less than strength, and loyalty became a currency spent and lost with the seasons. To maintain their rule, daimyo relied not only on the traditional samurai elite, but increasingly on large formations of a shigeru, foot soldiers drawn from the peasantry, drilled to fight in disciplined ranks. Battles once decided by individual valor now turned on numbers, formations, and coordination. Fortresses rose across the countryside, perched on mountains and river bends, built to withstand sieges and protect vital stores of rice and weapons. Around them grew castle towns, centers of administration, commerce, espionage, and war. Armorers, merchants, monks, and spies filled their streets. Each became a miniature capital, pulsing with ambition, rumor, and fear. Nowhere was this new order clearer than in the rivalries that defined the age. In the mountains of Kai, Takeda Shingen emerged as a commander of unmatched discipline and strategy. His armies moved with precision. His logistics were meticulous. His banners bore a creed that became legend: swift as the wind, silent as the forest, fierce as fire, immovable as the mountain. To the north stood Yasuji Kenshin, the dragon of Ekigo, his equal in resolve and brilliance. Their clashes, most famously at Kawanakajima, were not merely battles of arms, but duels of will. They respected one another, yet could not coexist. Each ruled absolutely. Each dreamed of expanding beyond the mountains that confined him. They were only two among many. In the west, the Mori clan extended its power across sea lanes and coastal strongholds. In the east, the Hojo of Odawara consolidated territory through calculated diplomacy, marriage, and fortress building. In the south, the Shimazu of Satsuma battled rivals across Kyushu. Everywhere, retainers overthrew masters, sons usurped fathers, and former peasants seized the banners of fallen lords. A new term defined the era: Gekukujo, the low overcoming the high. It was not merely a phrase. It was reality. Power no longer descended. It rose. Yet for all its violence, the Sengoku period was not only an age of destruction. From the chaos emerged innovation. Many warlords, seeking stability, enacted reforms that made their domains more efficient than anything Kyoto had ever produced. Laws were codified, trade regulated, taxes standardized, agriculture promoted, not out of benevolence, but because prosperity fed armies. Ironically, as national unity collapsed, local governance sharpened. Culture did not vanish in the turmoil. Samurai refined poetry and calligraphy within castle walls. The tea ceremony flourished even as war raged beyond the gates. Zen Buddhism offered solace to men who knew they might not survive the next campaign. Philosophy and brutality coexisted. A sword hung at every waist, yet incense still curled through the rafters. This was the paradox of Sengoku Japan: savagery and sophistication, often embodied in the same man. But beneath the elegance, the truth remained carved in steel. The country had no master. The emperor was a ghost. The shogun a shadow. Each castle town marched to its own destiny. Alliances shifted. Betrayal became routine. No lord slept easily. No family was secure. And through the blood and smoke, all waited for one who might rise, not merely as a conqueror of provinces, but as a unifier of the realm. That man had not yet appeared, but the roads were clearing, the swords were sharpening, and the dream of unity, buried beneath decades of war, had not died. It waited, as so many things in Japan did, in silence. Beyond the islands, the world was changing. Though the seas had long shielded Japan from the tides of empire and belief, the winds of the 16th century carried strange ships, stranger weapons, and unfamiliar gods. Even as daimyo clashed over rice fields and river crossings, the shores of Tanegashima bore witness to something new. In 1543, a Chinese junk carrying Portuguese merchants was driven off course by a storm and drifted onto the island's coast. The islanders did not yet know they were witnessing a turning point, one that would transform warfare, society, and faith. For the Portuguese brought with them not only steel and silk, but the arquebus, a crude yet deadly matchlock firearm that unleashed thunder and death without regard for lineage or swordsmanship. At first, it was a curiosity, but in an age where power turned on moments and margins, no advantage was ignored for long. The Lord of Tanegashima ordered his smiths to study the weapon, dismantle it, and reproduce it. Within a year, Japan was manufacturing its own firearms, and the age of the sword would never be the same. Word traveled fast. Warlords listened. The gun, once a foreign curiosity brought ashore by shipwrecked traders, became an object of lethal obsession. It was no longer a question of if the arquebus would be used, but how many and how soon. By the 1550s, firearms were no longer novelties. They were instruments of strategy. Daimyo wealthy enough to acquire them in quantity discovered that they could shatter cavalry charges, tear through elite warriors, and erase centuries of martial tradition from a distance. The age of the lone champion carving his legacy with a blade was ending. War became mathematics. Battles were decided by formations, timing, and coordinated volleys. Peasant conscripts, once the weakest link of any army, became its foundation. Trained to reload and fire in disciplined waves, they formed walls of smoke and lead that even the most renowned swordsman could not break. Castles changed. Walls thickened. Angles sharpened. Armor grew heavier, reshaped to deflect bullets rather than blades. Tactics evolved. The age of fluttering banners and heroic duels faded into memory. The battlefield became a place of thunder, smoke, and calculation. But the arquebus brought more than death. With the Portuguese traders came Jesuit missionaries, men in black robes who spoke of a single God, eternal salvation, and a faith that demanded belief rather than birth. They preached in marketplaces, castle towns, and fishing villages. Some learned Japanese with astonishing speed. Others needed only enough words to promise heaven. Their presence fascinated some and infuriated others. Yet many daimyo saw something else entirely: opportunity. Christian missionaries offered access to European trade, steady supplies of firearms, gunpowder, and foreign goods. For ambitious warlords, faith was secondary. This was diplomacy. Converts were rewarded. Missionaries protected. Churches rose beside castles. In Kyushu, Christian influence spread rapidly. In 1563, Omura Sumatada became the first Japanese daimyo to accept baptism, taking the name Bartholomew. He welcomed missionaries, dismantled Buddhist temples, and declared Christianity the official faith of his domain. Nearby, Nagasaki was open to Jesuit control. Churches were built, schools established, trade flourished. Nagasaki became a window into another world. European clocks ticked in Japanese streets. Foreign art adorned unfamiliar walls. Latin hymns echoed across stone harbors. Japan was no longer sealed, but not all welcomed the change. Many daimyo, rooted in Zen and Shinto traditions, viewed Christianity with growing suspicion. Its rejection of ancestor worship, its condemnation of Buddhism, and its insistence on exclusive devotion threatened the foundations of Japanese society. To some, the missionaries were little more than spies, agents of distant kings planting rebellion under the banner of heaven. Yet even the most hostile warlords could not ignore the weapons that arrived with the priests. Guns did not care about doctrine. Firearms and foreign faith carried another consequence, one subtler but just as profound. Japan's sense of itself began to shift. For centuries, the islands had seen themselves as a sacred realm apart, divinely protected from the ambitions of the wider world. Now ships arrived not with invading armies, but with ideas of global empires, distant continents, and power that stretched across oceans. The Sengoku warlords began to understand they were no longer merely provincial actors. They were players on a larger stage, and among them, one man saw more clearly than the rest. In Owari province, a minor lord began to rise. His name was Oda Nobunaga. He did not see Christianity as a threat or a salvation. He saw it as a tool. He did not view the arquebus as an insult to the sword, but as its successor. He would wield both. He would not fight for the favor of Kyoto, nor for the ghosts of Ashikaga shoguns. He would fight to end the age of division, and he would fight to win. For now, Japan remained a land of 100 banners. Guns and prayers arrived on the same ships. Daimyo ruled not by blood alone, but by walls, discipline, and firepower. It was an age of invention and heresy, opportunity and dread. The winds that once shielded Japan were now carrying change. And someone would open the gates. In the heart of Owari, among rice fields and narrow paths, a young warlord with contempt for tradition and fire in his eyes began pulling the threads of destiny toward himself. Oda Nobunaga was the second son of a minor lord, hardly a candidate for greatness. From the beginning, he defied expectation. He scorned etiquette. He wore common clothes. He mingled with performers and merchants. He fired guns in temple courtyards. The elders of Owari called him the Fool of Owari. Too wild to lead, too dangerous to trust. They were wrong. Behind the mockery burned a ruthless clarity. Nobunaga saw that the old world, of broken shoguns, empty rituals, and decaying hierarchies, was dying. And he intended not to preserve it, but to bury it. When his father, Oda Nobuhide, died in 1551, Nobunaga was not yet 20. His clan fractured. Retainers plotted to replace him with his half-brother. Advisors urged patience, submission, tradition. Nobunaga answered with blood. Assassinations, forced suicides, ruthless purges. One by one, his rivals vanished. By 1559, he stood alone at the head of the Oda clan. It was not a great house, but it sat astride a strategic corridor of central Japan. From there, he would begin to choke the country. Unlike other warlords who clung to ceremony while embracing firepower, Nobunaga rejected the past entirely. He adopted firearms not as supplements, but as the backbone of his army. He drilled synchronized volleys, perfected formations, replaced heroics with discipline. Talent mattered more than blood. Merchants and craftsmen were welcomed. Lineage meant nothing if a man could not build, supply, or fight. Nobunaga saw feudal Japan as a rotting structure, and he rebuilt it with gunpowder and intent. In 1560 came his first true test. Imagawa Yoshimoto, a powerful daimyo from the east, marched toward Kyoto with over 20,000 men. Nobunaga had barely 3,000. His allies urged retreat. His vassals despaired. Nobunaga did neither. At Okahazama, during a violent thunderstorm, he struck. His small force fell upon the Imagawa army while it rested, tents raised, guards lax. Chaos erupted. In the confusion, Nobunaga's men cut through the camp and reached Yoshimoto himself. The Imagawa lord was slain on the field. In a single afternoon, the balance of power shifted. The Fool of Owari was no longer laughing. The Imagawa army collapsed in panic. What had entered Owari as an overwhelming force dissolved into scattered bands fleeing for their lives. Oda Nobunaga, once dismissed as a reckless provincial lord, had struck down a titan and announced himself to the world. Okahazama was not merely a victory. It was a revelation. From that moment forward, Nobunaga moved with relentless momentum. He forged alliances when they were useful and abandoned them the moment they ceased to serve his purpose. Rival daimyo were crushed, their lands absorbed, their banners torn down and replaced. Step by calculated step, he tightened his grip on central Japan. Among his most important alliances was one forged with Tokugawa Ieyasu, the shrewd and patient lord of Mikawa. Where Nobunaga was fire, Ieyasu was stone. Their partnership was one of mutual necessity and respect, and it would endure long after Nobunaga's death, shaping the future of the nation. In 1568, Nobunaga marched into Kyoto, not as a humble servant of the throne, but as its master. He installed Ashikaga Yoshiaki as shogun, not to restore the Ashikaga dynasty, but to use it. The shogun would hold the title. Nobunaga would hold the power. When Yoshiaki began to assert his independence, Nobunaga responded without hesitation. Just as he had turned on rivals and allies before, he turned on the shogun himself. In 1573, Yoshiaki was driven from Kyoto, and with him fell the last Ashikaga shogunate. The age of the Bakufu ended not through reform or consensus, but because one man decided it no longer had a place in the world. Yet Nobunaga's ambition extended beyond conquest. He saw himself not merely as a warlord, but as the architect of a new Japan. He dismantled market monopolies, encouraged free commerce, standardized weights and measures, and welcomed foreign traders whose ships brought silver, gunpowder, and global connections. Wealth, he understood, was as decisive as armies. He welcomed Jesuit missionaries, not out of faith but strategy. Their presence weakened the great Buddhist institutions that had long resisted central authority. For centuries, powerful temples had been both spiritual and military forces, commanding wealth, land, and armies of warrior monks. To Nobunaga, they were obstacles. When the warrior monks of Mount Hai defied him, he responded with absolute brutality. In 1571, his forces surrounded the sacred mountain and set its temples ablaze. Monks, novices, women, and children were slaughtered indiscriminately. The fires of Enryakuji lit the sky above Kyoto, and blood ran down slopes once considered holy. To Nobunaga, it was not sacrilege. It was necessity. He continued reshaping the land in his own image. On the eastern shore of Lake Biwa, he built Azuchi Castle, a marvel of stone, height, and gold. It was not merely a fortress, but a statement. Azuchi was a vision of order rising from chaos, a declaration that the future belonged not to tradition, but to mastery. He sent emissaries to Europe. He corresponded with Jesuits. He styled himself a ruler beyond precedent. He accepted the name whispered by his enemies and followers alike, the demon king of the sixth heaven, and made it his own. No other lord of the age fused cruelty, charisma, and genius so completely. But Nobunaga ruled by momentum, not caution. He moved fast, trusted terror, and believed speed would always protect him. In doing so, he accumulated enemies as quickly as victories. Even his closest retainers feared him as much as they admired him. In the summer of 1582, while traveling with only a small escort, Nobunaga entered Honnoji Temple in Kyoto. At dawn, betrayal struck. One of his generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned against him. Whether driven by resentment, ambition, or madness remains uncertain. Mitsuhide's troops surrounded the temple and set it ablaze. Caught without his main army, Nobunaga refused capture. He fought, and when escape was impossible, he took his own life as flames consumed the hall. The man who had set out to remake Japan died not on a battlefield, but in fire and treachery. Yet his death did not erase his legacy. Nobunaga had shattered the old world and exposed its fragility. He had proven that power belonged not to lineage, but to those bold enough to seize it and ruthless enough to hold it. He had carved a road toward unity, even if he never walked it to the end, and others were already stepping onto that road. Nobunaga's death might have plunged the realm back into chaos, but among the fragments of his empire, one man acted faster than all others. A man born of humble origins, a man who had once served as a sandal-bearer. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi had been one of Nobunaga's most capable generals, small in stature, immense in cunning, tireless in energy. When news of the assassination reached him, he did not hesitate. He immediately made peace with the Mori clan, whom he had been fighting in the west, and turned his army east. Within 2 weeks, he cornered Akechi Mitsuhide at Yamazaki and destroyed him completely. Mitsuhide was killed while fleeing, his ambitions extinguished as quickly as they had flared. With that single victory, Hideyoshi seized control of the narrative. He was no longer merely Nobunaga's general. He was his avenger and his heir. The path to supremacy was not smooth. Many powerful retainers remained loyal to the Oda name and harbored ambitions of their own. But Hideyoshi proved as adept in diplomacy as he was in war. He married into noble families, rewarded allies lavishly, and disarmed rivals with promises before resorting to force. When conflict came, he ended it decisively. In 1583, the Battle of Shizugate secured his dominance over northern rivals. In 1584, tensions with Tokugawa Ieyasu threatened open war, but Hideyoshi chose patience. Peace was negotiated, alliances sealed by marriage, and confrontation delayed for another generation. By 1585, Hideyoshi was granted the title of Kampuku, imperial regent. He had no noble blood to justify it, but blood mattered less than power. The emperor, long sidelined, gave his blessing. In 1590, with the fall of the Hojo clan at Odawara, Hideyoshi completed what Nobunaga had begun. For the first time in more than a century, Japan stood unified under a single authority. Yet Hideyoshi did not become shogun. His birth as a peasant barred him from the title. Instead, he ruled through court offices and bureaucratic control, building a system that revolved entirely around himself. His palace at Jurakudai became the political center of the nation, opulent, disciplined, and absolute. Beneath the gold leaf and poetry contests lay an iron will. Hideyoshi understood how fragile unity was. To preserve it, he enacted sweeping reforms. In 1588, he ordered the Great Sword Hunt, confiscating weapons from peasants and non-samurai. The blades were melted down to cast a great Buddha statue, masking control in the language of piety. The message was unmistakable. Only the samurai would bear arms. Social mobility was frozen. Classes were rigidly defined. Domains were surveyed. Taxes standardized. Daimyo autonomy was curtailed. A web of control stretched from Kyoto to the furthest provinces. Japan, forged in chaos, now stood balanced, tense, centralized, and waiting for what would come next. Yet power did not temper his ambition. As Japan settled into an uneasy peace beneath his authority, Toyotomi Hideyoshi began to look beyond the horizon. The islands were unified. The daimyo were subdued. Fields were planted, castles repaired, temples rebuilt. But for a man who had risen from a peasant's hut to the apex of power, stillness felt like decay. Hideyoshi wanted more. Across the sea lay Joseon Korea, and beyond it, the vast prestige of Ming China. In his mind, Japan was no longer a fractured archipelago, but the heart of a rising empire. In 1592, he launched a massive invasion of the Korean peninsula, declaring his intention to march through Korea and conquer China itself. At first, the campaign moved swiftly. Japanese armies surged northward, overwhelming unprepared defenses and capturing major cities. But the illusion of inevitability soon shattered. Korean resistance hardened. Guerrilla forces harassed supply lines. Admiral Lee Sun-sin's navy strangled Japanese logistics at sea. Ming China intervened with fresh armies, and the war ground into a brutal stalemate. The conflict drained Japan's treasury and consumed tens of thousands of lives. When Hideyoshi launched a second invasion in 1597, it fared no better. The momentum was gone. The vision of continental empire collapsed into attrition and despair. In 1598, Hideyoshi died. With his death ended Japan's brief, bloody flirtation with overseas conquest. But even in his final days, Hideyoshi could not rest. His only son, Toyotomi Hideyori, was just a child. Knowing how quickly unity could dissolve, Hideyoshi established a council of 5 elders, Japan's most powerful lords, to govern collectively until the boy came of age. Among them stood Tokugawa Ieyasu. Hideyoshi's final act was not one of triumph, but of fear. Fear that without his hand on the reins, the fragile order he had forged would unravel. And in that fear, he was not wrong. Hideyoshi had risen from nothing and ruled everything. He transformed the nature of power in Japan, proving that ambition and talent could eclipse blood and tradition. His reforms laid the groundwork for peace that would last generations. Yet his legacy was incomplete. The child he left behind could not command the realm. The council he trusted would fracture, and the man who had waited patiently through decades of chaos would soon move. Not to serve the Toyotomi name, but to bury it. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi was laid to rest in the autumn of 1598, the air over Japan thickened not with mourning, but with tension. The great unifier was gone, and with him the force that had held rival ambitions in check. Though the daimyo had bent the knee, they had done so under the weight of Hideyoshi's shadow. With his death, that shadow lifted. Old rivalries stirred. Long-suppressed calculations resurfaced. At the center of the regency stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, lord of Mikawa and master of the vast Kanto region. He was a man forged by survival, patient, methodical, relentlessly cautious. While others chased glory with raised banners and clashing steel, Ieyasu watched, listened, and waited. He had survived Oda Nobunaga. He had outlived Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And now, he stood as the most powerful lord left standing. Ieyasu had served both men faithfully, displaying humility when required and obedience when useful. But loyalty had never blinded him. With Hideyoshi gone and the regency divided, he recognized that the moment he had prepared for all his life had finally arrived. The years following Hideyoshi's death saw the slow unraveling of the fragile balance. Beneath layers of ceremony and polite oaths, factions formed. On one side gathered Ieyasu and those who favored firm central authority, men with little loyalty to a child ruler. On the other stood those who claimed allegiance to the Toyotomi house, or feared what Tokugawa dominance would bring. At the head of this opposition rose Ishida Mitsunari, a court official elevated under Hideyoshi's rule. Not a great general, but a skilled administrator with influence in Kyoto, Mitsunari accused Ieyasu of betraying the regency, of stockpiling power, of preparing to usurp the Toyotomi heir. Ieyasu did not deny the charge. He simply continued moving his pieces. By 1600, Japan stood on the brink of civil war once more. Alliances shifted. Messengers rode through the night. Samurai sharpened blades. Domains chose sides. And when the storm finally broke, it did so not in Kyoto's palaces, but on the mist-covered fields of Sekigahara. On the morning of October 21st, 1600, two armies faced one another across a narrow mountain plain. Ieyasu commanded roughly 75,000 men, the Eastern Army, drawn from loyal vassals and opportunistic allies. Opposing him, Ishida Mitsunari led nearly 80,000 troops, the Western Army, composed of Toyotomi loyalists and lords fearful of Tokugawa rule. Banners snapped in the cold air. Commanders scanned the hills not only for enemy movements, but for betrayal. Sekigahara was never meant to be won by force alone. For weeks before the battle, Ieyasu had quietly courted commanders in the opposing camp, offering land, titles, and survival. Among them was Kobayakawa Hideaki, a young, uncertain general positioned on a crucial hill overlooking the battlefield. As the fog lifted and the fighting began, the outcome remained uncertain. Arrows darkened the sky. Muskets thundered. Samurai crashed together in waves of steel and screams. Blood soaked the ground. Then Ieyasu made his move. He ordered his gunners to fire toward Kobayakawa's position, not to destroy it, but to force a decision. Under pressure, Hideaki turned his troops not against Tokugawa, but against his supposed allies. The Western Army's flank collapsed. What followed was not a battle, but a rout. Ishida Mitsunari fled, only to be captured days later. He was taken to Kyoto and executed. Other commanders surrendered or were hunted down. Their lands were confiscated, their families scattered, their names erased. Sekigahara ended more than a war. It ended an era. With Toyotomi authority shattered and resistance crushed, Tokugawa Ieyasu emerged as the undisputed master of Japan. Yet he did not rush to claim ultimate power. He returned to Edo, consolidated his holdings, rewarded allies, punished enemies, and rebuilt the web of authority slowly, deliberately, and entirely on his terms. In 1603, the emperor granted him the title of Sei Taishogun. The title had once been ceremonial. In Ieyasu's hands, it became absolute. Thus began the Tokugawa Shogunate, the final and longest-lasting military government in Japanese history. The chaos of the Sengoku age was over. The land fell silent, and from the blood-soaked fields of Sekigahara, Tokugawa Ieyasu began constructing a peace colder, stricter, and more enduring than any Japan had ever known. He chose to plant the center of his power not in Kyoto, the ancient seat of emperors where memory weighed heavier than authority, nor in Osaka, where the last Toyotomi heir lingered behind massive stone walls as a living symbol of unresolved war. Instead, Tokugawa Ieyasu turned east to Edo, a damp marshland outpost far from the rituals and rivalries of the old court. What had once been an unremarkable castle town, surrounded by wetlands and tidal rivers, he transformed into the administrative core of a new Japan. From this distance, both geographic and symbolic, he insulated himself from the intrigues that had consumed so many before him. Edo was not burdened by tradition. It could be shaped entirely to his will. From that eastern stronghold, Ieyasu constructed a system of governance unlike any Japan had known before. His rule was not built on spectacle or charisma, nor on the myth of divine heroism that had surrounded earlier warlords. Instead, the Tokugawa order was engineered with deliberate restraint. It was a structure designed to endure pressure, not inspire awe, a fortress made not of stone alone, but of regulation, obligation, and controlled dependence. Ieyasu understood something his rivals had not. Peace was fragile, and trust alone could never sustain it. What Japan required was a system that made rebellion not heroic, but futile. He did not abolish the daimyo, the regional lords whose private armies had once torn the country apart. To do so would have invited immediate resistance. Instead, he preserved their titles and lands while quietly dismantling their independence. Each lord was permitted to govern his domain, but always under the watchful authority of the shogunate. The most effective tool of this control was the Sankenkotai system, the policy of alternate attendance. Every daimyo was required to spend alternating years in Edo, while his family remained there permanently. Wives and heirs became living guarantees of loyalty, hostages in all but name. The system was elegant in its cruelty. Maintaining two households, traveling vast distances with enormous retinues, and participating in the rituals of court life drained the daimyo of both wealth and energy. Any ambition for rebellion was exhausted long before it could be realized. Castles could not be expanded. Armies could not be raised in secret. Surveillance became unnecessary because defiance itself became impractical. The lords retained their dignity, but their freedom had been bound with threads of silk and iron. Obedience was no longer enforced through open violence, but through quiet inevitability. This philosophy of controlled stability extended into every layer of society. Under Tokugawa rule, social hierarchy hardened into law. The four-tier class system, samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants, was rigidly enforced. At the top stood the samurai, no longer defined by the battlefield, but transformed into administrators, clerks, and bureaucrats of the state. Their swords remained, but largely as symbols. Beneath them were the farmers, whose rice harvest sustained the entire system and was measured, taxed, and recorded with meticulous care. Artisans followed, crafting the tools, textiles, and goods of daily life. At the bottom were the merchants, officially despised as profit-seekers, yet quietly accumulating wealth and influence in the shadows of the economy. Movement between classes was forbidden. A man's birth determined his destiny. Where the chaos of the Sengoku age had allowed men to rise through war, the Tokugawa era offered peace through immobility. Stability replaced opportunity. Order replaced ambition. Japan did not merely disarm its armies, it froze its society. The emperor remained in Kyoto, cloaked in ancient sanctity and ceremonial reverence. Ieyasu did not dismantle the imperial court, for he understood that legitimacy flowed from tradition as surely as authority flowed from power. The rituals continued. Poems were composed. Sacred dances unfolded beneath palace roofs, unchanged for centuries. But these acts had become symbolic performances, a carefully preserved illusion of continuity. True power had migrated east. Edo pulsed with canals, roads, warehouses, and law codes. It was in Edo that decisions were made. It was in Edo that Japan was governed. Religion, too, was brought under control. Ieyasu regarded Christianity with deep suspicion, not because of theology, but because of allegiance. A faith that demanded loyalty beyond the shogunate posed a threat to the carefully balanced order he had constructed. Though Toyotomi Hideyoshi had already begun persecuting Christians, it was under Tokugawa rule that suppression became systematic and relentless. Missionaries were expelled. Converts were forced to renounce their faith publicly or face execution. Communities were dismantled. Fear became policy. Buddhism, by contrast, was absorbed into the machinery of the state. Temples were required to register citizens, effectively turning religious institutions into instruments of surveillance. Orthodoxy was enforced not through belief, but through administration. Faith was tolerated only when it served order. The Tokugawa sword permitted no divided loyalty. Yet for all its rigidity, the early Tokugawa era was not defined by despair. It was a time of recovery and renewal. After generations of warfare, the land was allowed to heal. Fields were planted without fear of armies marching through them. Roads became safe for travelers. Markets reopened. Towns expanded. Peace created space for culture to flourish. Kabuki theater drew crowds. Woodblock prints spread images and stories across the country. Haiku poetry distilled emotion into silence. Art returned not as propaganda, but as expression. The samurai class, once forged by violence, turned inward. Philosophy, ethics, and governance replaced battlefield tactics. A generation was born that would never hear the roar of massed armies. For the first time in centuries, war became memory rather than expectation. Ieyasu himself did not live to witness the full maturity of the world he had shaped. In 1605, he formally retired, passing the title of shogun to his son Hidetada, though real authority remained firmly in his hands until his death in 1616. Even in death, he ensured his presence would endure. His body was enshrined at Nikko, where he was deified as Tasho Daigongen, the great incarnate deity of the East. The shrine, ornate and silent beneath towering cedar trees, became a physical manifestation of Tokugawa permanence. He had begun life as a hostage, survived under the dominance of Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and outlived them all. He had not conquered Japan through brilliance alone, but through patience, calculation, and restraint. The age of warlords ended not with a final battle, but with a decision to stop fighting. The first decades of Tokugawa peace settled over Japan like snow upon scorched earth. The violence of the Sengoku age faded into stories told by aging veterans who now carried swords only for ceremony. In place of chaos came balance, carefully maintained, quietly enforced. War did not merely cease, it became unthinkable. But it was Ieyasu's successors who fortified this peace against the future. Hidetada, and more decisively his son Imitsu, ruled not as conquerors but as engineers of isolation. Their governance extended beyond land and armies into movement, thought and contact with the outside world. The shogunate became a silent authority, shaping lives without spectacle. Its power lay in its invisibility. One of the defining pillars of this era was sakoku, the policy of national seclusion. Beginning in the 1630s, foreign contact was tightly restricted. Portuguese missionaries were expelled. Christianity was eradicated with brutal efficiency. The Shimabara Rebellion of 1637, led by desperate peasants and persecuted Christians, confirmed the fears of the Tokugawa elite. Its destruction became the final justification for sealing Japan from the unpredictable currents of the world beyond its shores. Foreign trade did not vanish entirely. The Dutch, uninterested in conversion and willing to submit to strict oversight, were confined to the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Bay. Through them, fragments of Western science, medicine, and astronomy entered Japan in whispers. This knowledge, Rangaku or Dutch learning, remained marginal for now, but it planted seeds that would one day challenge the system itself. Japan turned inward not out of fear, but conviction. To the Tokugawa rulers, peace was not simply the absence of war. It was the active enforcement of harmony. Chaos was not defeated, it was prevented. And so, beneath a sky finally free of smoke, Japan entered a long stillness, carefully designed, tightly controlled, and destined to endure for more than 2 centuries. Within the borders of Tokugawa Japan, the daimyo still ruled in name, but in practice their freedom had narrowed to a carefully measured illusion. The Sankenkotai system, alternate attendance, had matured into a tool not only of loyalty, but of quiet financial suffocation. Each lord was required to travel to Edo with massive processions that stretched for miles, an extravagant display meant to signal prestige, yet designed to drain resources. The highways of the shogunate filled with banners, armor, and servants, but beneath the pageantry lay exhaustion. The cost of maintaining 2 residences, one in their home domain, another in Edo, bled the daimyo dry. Their wives and heirs remained in the capital, hostages not in chains, but in circumstance. Escape was unnecessary. Defiance had become economically impossible. To support this system, infrastructure expanded across the realm. Roads were paved and widened, checkpoints erected, and official stations established to monitor movement. Travel permits became a fact of life. Commoners could not wander freely between provinces. Merchants, monks, and pilgrims moved only with approval. Japan had not become a prison, but it had become a place where every step left a record. Motion itself was regulated. Stillness was rewarded. The samurai, once defined by the thunder of cavalry charges and the clash of steel, found themselves reshaped by peace. Their swords remained at their sides, symbols of inherited authority, yet their daily lives revolved around documents, ledgers, and legal codes. They became clerks, magistrates, and tax administrators. For some, this transformation was a humiliation, a slow erosion of the warrior spirit their ancestors had died for. For others, it was an opportunity. Confucian scholarship flourished among the samurai class. Philosophy replaced battlefield tactics. Debate replaced combat. Honor was measured not in blood spilled, but in discipline, learning, and obedience to order. Below them, the peasantry endured the weight of the system. Farmers fed the nation and bore the heaviest taxes, bound to land they did not own, laboring under regulations that governed when and how they could plant, harvest, and sell. Above them, in contradiction to the rigid hierarchy, merchants accumulated wealth at a staggering pace. Official ideology scorned them as parasites, yet cities depended on them. They supplied rice brokers, financed shipping networks, and extended credit even to samurai themselves. Status and power began to drift apart. The sword commanded respect, but the coin commanded reality. Urban life expanded rapidly. Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto grew into vast population centers, humming with trade, labor, and entertainment. Edo, once a marshland outpost, swelled into one of the largest cities on Earth. Its neighborhoods buzzed with activity, markets crowded with voices, tea houses filled with laughter, bridges alive with traffic. Gossip traveled faster than official decrees. Culture flourished in the spaces left untouched by rigid law. The Jinroku era marked a golden bloom of urban culture. Kabuki theater transformed from outlaw spectacle into refined performance, its actors becoming celebrities whose faces were recognized across the islands. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints captured scenes of fleeting pleasure. Courtesans mid-laugh, landscapes frozen in seasonal beauty, actors immortalized in dramatic poses. Poets like Matsuo Basho wandered far from the cities, composing haiku that reduced entire worlds to a handful of syllables. Peace had suppressed violence, but it had unleashed creativity. Yet beneath the elegance lay tension. Authority still rested on the memory of force. Freedom was limited, but expression found ways to bloom in narrow cracks. There were no sweeping revolutions, no civil wars, only murmurs of dissent quickly smothered. Time moved slowly, eroding ambition. Generations were born who knew war only as stories told by aging men whose swords had never tasted battle. For more than a century, the system held. Land passed from father to son without fear of invasion. Samurai inherited titles without ever marching to war. The Tokugawa peace was not utopian, but it was stable. And stability, maintained long enough, hardened into certainty. Yet no structure built on absolute control remains untouched by decay. What had once shielded Japan from chaos gradually became a cage of immobility. The very rigidity that ensured peace also resisted adaptation. Beneath the silence, fractures spread unseen. By the 18th century, the Tokugawa bureaucracy had grown heavy and slow. Procedures multiplied. Decisions stagnated. Officials protected precedent rather than people. Corruption, once punished swiftly, now lingered in exchange for loyalty. Daimyo weakened further, stripped of initiative and reduced to ceremonial figures in some domains. Samurai, burdened by stipends fixed to an earlier economy, sank into debt. Their relevance faded, and with it, their confidence. Nature delivered blows the system could not deflect. A series of catastrophic famines swept the countryside, none more devastating than the Tenmei famine of the 1780s. Volcanic eruptions darkened the skies. Floods ruined harvests. Rice prices soared beyond reach. Families sold children to survive. In some regions, desperation drove people to unthinkable acts. Hunger ignited rage. Peasant uprisings flared across provinces. Storehouses stormed, merchants attacked, officials driven from towns. Most revolts were crushed, but they exposed a fragile truth. The hierarchy survived only so long as suffering remained tolerable. In the cities, merchants continued to thrive, quietly undermining the social order. Though officially despised, they financed the nation. Samurai indebted to them simmered with resentment, but lacked the authority to strike. Economic power had slipped beyond the reach of swords. Ideas, too, began to shift. Scholars of Kokugaku, or national learning, challenged the dominance of Confucian ideology, advocating a return to ancient Japanese traditions and elevating the emperor's divine lineage. Others studied Dutch texts in secret, medicine, astronomy, engineering, absorbing fragments of a wider world Japan pretended did not exist. Knowledge moved like a slow current beneath the surface, invisible yet unstoppable. Reformers within the shogunate attempted to respond. Matsudaira Sadanobu's Kansei reforms sought to restore discipline and frugality, to stabilize the economy and reinforce moral governance. They offered momentary relief, but the deeper illness remained. The system had been built to resist rebellion, not stagnation. Beyond Japan's shores, the world was changing with terrifying speed. Western empires expanded across oceans. Steam-powered ships replaced sails. Cannons mounted on iron hulls rewrote the language of power. While Japan looked inward, the world advanced, and the distance between isolation and reality grew thinner with each passing year. The Tokugawa peace still held, but its silence had begun to crack. All the while, the island nation clung to its rituals, unchanged ceremonies repeated with near-religious precision, censored maps that shrank the world to fit familiar borders, and an enduring belief in self-sufficiency that had once been a source of strength. The Tokugawa Shogunate had engineered a society capable of enduring famine, smothering dissent, and extinguishing revolt before it could grow into flame. Order was its greatest triumph, but time was its unrelenting enemy. Time could not be arrested by law or ritual. Hunger gnawed at the poor. Curiosity stirred among scholars. Ambition pulsed through the merchant class. And beyond the horizon, forces were gathering that no decree could silence. For more than 2 centuries, Japan's gates had remained closed. Yet change does not require permission to approach. It advances quietly, carried on the tide. By the mid-19th century, the sound of its arrival could already be imagined. Boots striking foreign decks, voices speaking languages no magistrate could command into silence, sails rising on the eastern horizon like dark wings poised to descend. The walls of Edo still stood. The banners of the shogunate still flew. But hairline fractures spread beneath stone and symbol alike. A storm was coming. That storm arrived not with marching armies, but with smoke, steam, and iron. On a humid summer morning in 1853, the waters of Edo Bay trembled beneath the approach of 4 massive vessels. They were unlike anything Japan had ever seen. Black-hulled steamships of the United States Navy, looming and unnatural, belching coal smoke into the sky like creatures pulled from some foreign myth. Their cannons, mounted along iron flanks, possessed a destructive power capable of leveling castles from beyond the reach of any Japanese weapon. At their head stood Commodore Matthew Perry, not sent to conquer Japan outright, but to force it open. His mission was framed as diplomacy. The message he carried spoke of friendship, trade, and mutual benefit. But the threat was unmistakable. Every cannon spoke more clearly than any letter. Perry delivered a message from President Millard Fillmore, announced his intention to return for an answer, and departed with deliberate ceremony. The black ships withdrew, but they left behind something far more dangerous than fire: certainty. The certainty that isolation had ended. The certainty that the old world was no longer defensible. For generations, the samurai had stood as the unchallenged masters of the land. Now they gathered along the shore, staring out at a power they could neither match nor fully comprehend. The Tokugawa Shogunate had preserved peace by sealing Japan off from the chaos of the world. But that very isolation had become a vulnerability. While Japan refined hierarchy and ritual, the Western world had undergone industrial revolutions, mastered mechanized warfare, and reshaped global power through steam and steel. To the Americans, Japan was not merely a curiosity. It was a strategic harbor for whaling fleets, a potential market, and a crucial position in the imperial contest unfolding across Asia. Perry did not negotiate. He presented demands. He promised to return. And when he did in 1854, he arrived with more ships, more guns, and an ultimatum that could no longer be ignored. Within the shogunate, panic and paralysis set in. Councils argued. Precedents were consulted. Traditions weighed heavily on every decision. But tradition offered no defense against cannon fire. In the spring of that year, the Tokugawa government signed the Treaty of Kanagawa. 2 ports were opened to American ships. A U.S. consul was permitted to reside in Japan. The first stone was removed from the wall of isolation. Others soon followed. Britain, Russia, France, and the Netherlands extracted treaties of their own, many under the open threat of bombardment. These agreements became known as the unequal treaties. They granted foreigners sweeping privileges, extraterritorial rights, fixed low tariffs, and legal immunity from Japanese courts. Each clause carved away another piece of sovereignty. Japan had not been conquered, but it had been compelled. The illusion of control shattered. As foreign influence spread, internal division deepened. Samurai who had known only peace now faced a world where swords were meaningless against rifles, and diplomacy demanded flexibility rather than honor. Two visions emerged. One believed the shogunate could modernize, adopt Western technology, and survive. The other believed it had forfeited legitimacy and must be destroyed. The rallying cry of Sano joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, spread rapidly among the disillusioned. Southern domains such as Satsuma and Chashu became centers of radical thought. Ironically, while denouncing foreign influence, these domains embraced Western weapons, military training, and shipbuilding. They did not seek a return to the past. They sought revolution, cloaked in imperial loyalty. The shogunate attempted reform. Envoys were sent abroad. Modern ships were constructed. New military units were formed. But each effort was slowed by internal resistance, bureaucratic inertia, and eroding trust. The government appeared indecisive, too traditional to fully modernize, too compromised to command loyalty. By 1867, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the final shogun, stood atop a structure already collapsing. Recognizing the inevitability of change, he formally returned governing authority to the emperor in Kyoto. It was a gesture meant to preserve peace. Instead, it accelerated the fall. In 1868, civil war erupted. The Boshin War pitted Tokugawa loyalists against imperial forces backed by reformist domains. Though brief, the conflict was decisive. Edo fell and was renamed Tokyo, the eastern capital, a symbolic declaration of rebirth. By 1869, the Tokugawa were defeated. The shogunate, which had ruled Japan for over 2.5 centuries, ceased to exist. What followed was the Meiji Restoration, an upheaval without precedent. It was not merely a change in ruler, but a reimagining of the nation itself. Feudal domains were abolished. A centralized government emerged. Industry, education, and the military were rapidly modernized. Japan raced to catch up with the world that had forced its gates open. The samurai, once the spine of society, found themselves displaced almost overnight. Their stipends were eliminated. Their right to bear swords, once the ultimate symbol of authority, was revoked. Armor was replaced by Western uniforms. Privilege dissolved into memory. Some adapted, becoming officers, bureaucrats, or educators. Many fell into poverty. A few rebelled, unable to accept a world that no longer had a place for them. But rebellion could not reverse time. The age of steel blades and feudal loyalties had yielded to railways, rifles, and factories. The black ships had not simply arrived at Edo Bay. They had broken the spell of stillness that had held Japan in place for centuries. The world of the shogunate, the world of silent streets, hereditary power, and ritualized obedience, had reached its final chapter. The samurai did not vanish in a single moment of fire and blood. They faded, quietly, inexorably. Their legacy survived not on the battlefield, but in memory, myth, and the pages of history, as Japan stepped forward into a new and unforgiving age. They were instructed to reinvent themselves, to enter government offices, enlist in a modern army, teach in newly built schools, or trade in the marketplaces of a changing nation. Some complied and adapted. Others drifted into obscurity, stripped of purpose and status. And a small number chose death over a life divorced from the code that had shaped their families for generations. Yet even as their authority dissolved, the idea of the samurai refused to vanish. It lingered across the landscape like mist in a mountain pass, subtle, persistent, impossible to fully dispel. In towns and rural villages alike, in the recollections of elders and the songs of wandering storytellers, the samurai endured. Their clashes and betrayals, their loyalty and ambition hardened into legend. Their names were murmured in classrooms, etched into household shrines, printed on woodblock art, and traded in markets where their descendants now sold rice, silk, or tools. The Meiji state, for all its urgency to modernize, recognized the power of memory. It did not erase the samurai. It repurposed them. Their legacy was absorbed into a new national identity. Warriors became symbols of discipline, obedience, and sacrifice. The sword, once forbidden, survived as ritual. Bushido, once fluid and contradictory, was distilled into an idealized creed. Stoic, loyal, uncompromising. In reality, the samurai had never been uniform. They were not always virtuous. They waged civil wars, executed rivals, burned villages, and toppled temples. Their past was marked as much by cruelty as by honor. But memory is selective. People do not preserve contradictions. They preserve stories. The lone fighter standing against impossible odds. The retainer who chose death over betrayal. The lord who surrendered his lands to spare his people. These were the images that endured. The new imperial army, modeled after European forces, deliberately drew upon samurai imagery to instill discipline and unity. Bushido was invoked to harden resolve, to sanctify obedience, to make sacrifice not only acceptable but noble. In schools, children memorized the names of legendary warriors and were urged to embody their virtues. In the process, the samurai were transformed. No longer a social class, but a national myth. No longer men of the sword, but an idea embedded in the identity of modern Japan. Even the final rebellions of the old warrior order were woven into this narrative. Figures such as Seigo Takamori, who led a doomed uprising against the Meiji government in 1877, were later reimagined. Seigo, killed after his forces were crushed, was posthumously elevated into a tragic symbol, a man who died for principle rather than submission. Statues were erected. His life inspired novels, plays, and films. In death, he achieved what he could not in life: immortality within the mythology of the samurai. As the 20th century began, Japan stood transformed. Railways replaced horse trails. Firearms eclipsed bows. The emperor, once hidden behind court ritual, now presided openly over a rising industrial power. Yet beneath factories and uniforms, echoes of the old world remained. They survived in the precision of martial arts, in the stillness of the tea ceremony, in the deliberate stroke of calligraphy. Feudal Japan had not vanished. It had been absorbed. When Japan entered modern wars, it was the language of the samurai that commanders invoked. Whether fully understood or not, its symbols were carried into battle. Time passed. Wars ended. Empires collapsed. Japan fell, then rebuilt itself. The samurai did not return, but they were never erased. Today, their armor rests behind museum glass. Their blades lie silent, preserved but unused. Their castles stand in ruin, their banners faded. Their names are spoken not with fear, but with reverence. And still their spirit, reshaped by centuries of war, peace, and retelling, moves quietly through the culture. The samurai were born in blood, ruled through power, and faded without ceremony. Yet their story did not end. It lives on not only in what they were, but in what they became, the embodiment of a nation's memory. A memory of loyalty tested by betrayal, of duty placed above self, of honor carried forward long after the sword was laid down. They are gone, but the legacy they left behind still pulses beneath the surface of Japan, where the heart of the feudal past continues to beat.